My name's Barry Cranford. This is a fractional consultant community event. The FCC, the community, has been around now for about 6 months, and rapidly expanded to 500 people. So quite clearly, there's a lot of interest in this fractional space and what fractionals can do for businesses. But I think there's still a lot of
Is it just me?
No, I don't think so.
Always a great expression. It freezes on as well, isn't it?
Well, that is often me.
What do you think, Andreas? Want to crack on?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe maybe you introduce yourself and then I'll introduce myself. Ladies first.
Okay, I'll always take a bit of chivalry. So I'm Amy. I started my career 15 years ago in search marketing, and I worked for a specialist agency that was sold to Adobe. And I was really lucky because it was a time when there was a massive supply gap in the marketing industry. People weren't training as digital marketing execs back then, and I was able to become a consultant very, very quickly because there was demand for people with my level of expertise. I spent about 5 years of my career working in network agencies, doing one of two things. One would be that the client was a key client and they were really upset. And the other was that they had issues with the team resigning, kind of, complex stakeholder environment. So I did lots of triage within the network agency. Through that, I met relationships in the investment space, and I actually started my own agency in 2014 because I had too much demand to kind of handle on a day rate basis. So I built up a team of grads to about 7 of us at its peak, and I was kind of business development and strategy while the grads were doing all the execution and account management. After Brexit, that kind of wound down a bit and I went back to consulting. So I went in client side, sort of like head of digital at big organizations. And then since 2019, I've been a CMO. I was a CMO in a fractional way before it was really a thing, just because I work with startups. So heading into COVID, I was split across the ING incubator and working with a VC-backed insurtech. So I started working in a fractional way as soon as I became a CMO. I've kind of mixed that up depending on how the market's responding. I've worked through sort of Odgers and Wilton and Bain on big corporate CMO roles. So I'm quite unique in that I've worked a lot of different projects over my 15-year history, but I've also worked with everything from back of a napkin startup right through to one of my biggest clients, I think had about 1.7 billion turnover, and I had a team of 300 and my budget was like 80 million. So it means that even though I can still do big corporate roles, I'm still on my toes, kind of working on very basic teams where I'm sometimes having to get my hands dirty doing lots of different things. And I'm pretty sector agnostic. I've worked on pretty much everything you can think of apart from sort of like weapons, politics, and fast fashion, which basically tells you everything you need to know about me.
That is really cool. Thank you, Amy. I'm Andreas. I'm the founder and fractional SEO consultant of Artios. And I got into SEO 20 years ago. I was actually an accountant working as a financial controller for an industrial company, but I grew fascinated as to how can you get all that lovely free traffic from the internet, and that's where my journey started. And since then, obviously things have changed quite a lot in terms of the web. We have mobile, social media, and all kinds of things that have moved on since then. And I've been lucky enough to work with and still work with companies like Amazon Europe, but these days mainly I either train enterprise teams, enterprise SEO teams for enterprise brands like Amazon, or I'm consulting with startups, mainly from pre-seed to Series B. And like Amy, I'm sector agnostic. I've done my share of consulting with network agencies, but also independent agencies based in UK and worldwide. I mean, in terms of SEO, I've seen a lot. I'm not saying I know everything, far from it. I'm learning every day. Also, before I forget, I'm also the published author of Data Driven SEO. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Thank you.
I'm back. Sorry if I froze completely through that. I don't know how far through the introduction you got, but then I came back into Amy introducing herself, went again and came back into Andreas. So forgive me, but like we're all working it. So yeah, it worked. Okay, so I'm going to start with my first question then, which is for Andreas here. So Andreas and I met at the FCC Unconference that we ran recently. And this is really what triggered this event and what kicked the whole thing off. It was an interesting conversation. He said he'd come into the world of fractionals. He'd hired a fractional CMO, and if I remember correctly, it had a huge impact on the business. He'd seen a concern, seen a question mark there, and then went through this long process to interview a bunch of different fractional CMOs. He'd found one that he was really keen on, and then they'd made this massive impact. And I was like, wow, okay, I need to talk to you more. And I was like, well, since I'm talking to you to figure this out, why don't we run a session around it? Then we met Amy, and everyone came together that way. So Andreas, could you do me a favor and could you just tell that story again? Just why did you get somebody? What was the process like in terms of interviewing, screening, hiring, and what difference have they made?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It was a very interesting conversation over games of ping pong. We both played very well. I forget to recall who actually won. I'm not sure we were tracking, but so look, this was the situation. I had a business website that was pretty visible in Google, but in terms of the ratio of leads or inquiries to visitors was very low. And I kind of felt that the communications part of the website was pretty dated. And, my specialism is in organic search, whilst, obviously you have to understand marketing. There was the sort of broader I decided that I needed a reliable sample. And can you still hear me?
I dropped out for a little bit, just came back in. I don't know if everyone else did, but yeah, I think I got up to a point where you said that you had a specialism in organic search, so you had to understand marketing.
Yeah, so I understand marketing, but I felt the communications piece was missing from my website. So I decided, being quite data driven, to get a decent sample size, and then I just went on LinkedIn and contacted over 100 fractional CMOs. Managed to get meetings with 50 of them in the week, and it was really, really interesting. I ended up with a short list of 3 and hired 1. And it really turned my business around, because from that point on, I started and still continue to get more business from the website. It's actually working for the business, for the brand Artios, and it's been invaluable. Really, it's really given me the confidence to step up and ramp up the channel outreach program.
Fantastic. Okay, can I just dig into a bit of that, then unpack a bit of
Please.
it? So you contacted 100 from LinkedIn, and you then organized 50 meetings, and then you went from 50 to 3.
Yes.
So I feel like I could talk to you for hours about what that experience was like, right? But so what did you discover in this search of speaking to all these different people? Like, what did you end up with any kind of thoughts, any summaries of, or start classifying different people? And how did you get to 3?
Yes, certainly. So what I learned from speaking to 50 CMOs in the week is that different fractional CMOs have different ideas on what being a CMO means. Some of them call themselves a fractional CMO, but actually they're really digital marketing managers, or more what I would say performance media directors or managers. Their real specialism is is being given a chunk of budget or money and then getting the highest ROI. So I didn't go with those types because I kind of felt that there was something a lot more fundamental missing, which is, what do we stand for? What is our position? What do we sound like as a brand? You know, who should we be talking to? Who are our ideal customers? You know, those were the fundamental questions that were missing. So that's why I didn't proceed the conversations with those people. Other fractional CMOs were actually social media consultants, and a few of them were actually business development consultants that specialized in cold outreach on LinkedIn and other social channels, or even non-social channels. So I found that quite interesting. And so, you know, of the shockingly minority of the 50 CMOs who actually, I felt, understood what marketing is, right? You know, there's marketing and there's advertising, and they seem to be more marketing focused.
You know what's super interesting about this, and working in recruitment, I understand where you're coming from with this, because a lot of people don't know, they know who they are, but they don't know who they are in relation to everyone else in the industry, in the same way that when you interview that many people, you do, you know, so people think they're one thing and believe they're one thing. And when they compare themselves to 10 others, if they all excel in a certain thing and someone falls back, so it's such an interesting piece, and to hear you go through it. So how did you then spot the ones that were part of the 3 versus the ones that were 47? Like I know kind of from what you're saying what you were looking for, but how did you understand? How did you cut through it? How did you say yes and no?
Yeah, I think it was just based on the questions they were asking, the way they charge, their pricing models, what they were willing to provide, and you know, ultimately it was really down to the ones that I were most interested in and ended up shortlisting were asking the right questions. You know, why do people want to work with you? You know, what makes you different? All those kinds of things. And who do you think you should be working with, rather than you know, rather than telling me what they were going to do for me, but actually hadn't quite established what I needed. You know, they were so much more in the kind of solutions conversation rather than trying to establish what the issue was. And so the ones that were more interested in establishing what the challenges and the issues were with my business were the marketers, as opposed to the business developers or the sort of channel managers or performance media buying specialists.
Brilliant. Okay, very interesting. Okay, I'm going to put that on pause for a minute, and I'm going to come back afterwards to hear what they did, the difference they made, and how that was all implemented and that kind of thing. But Amy, keen to get your thoughts on what Andreas is saying there. Like, obviously, I know, as you said, you've worked with, I wrote it down here, back of a napkin startups and people with a 1.7 billion turnover. I mean, so different. What do you think about this variety of CMOs and how to cut through a lot to get down to a shorter list?
Well, it's really interesting listening to what Andreas has said, because I've been on the other end of all of that, right? So I've been in interviews for a CMO role where they've asked me if I can write content, or I've been in an interview for a CMO role if they've asked me if I know how to install Google Analytics, right? I mean, I do know how to do these things, but if you're interviewing for a CMO, you shouldn't really be having those questions asked to you. So I think it depends a lot on the size of the organization. I would say the number one thing is going to be the size of the organization, right? Because if you take the biggest role that I've had, essentially that's a leadership role. And, you know, I've got lots of friends who are CEOs, and one of the things that one said to me that I really resonated with me is like, actually a really good CEO should be doing nothing, because their role is to facilitate everybody else's processes working properly. So if you're a CMO in the biggest types of organization, I would say that's what you need to try and aspire to, because you've got this whole team, you know, that you need to have functioning properly. And really, your role should be all about getting that in place and really slickly oiled machine. And that really you should only be coming in if there's fires to fight. And, you know, in a big organization, there's fires to fight every week. So it's a bit different. But I think when you think right down to the other end, the biggest challenge you get with startups, I'd say, is the expectation management. And this is a really hard thing to articulate because, you know, £500,000, £2 million, that's a lot of money to raise. And when you're a startup founder and you've gone through that, especially now, the market's so tough, like to raise that much money. But then when you look at it in terms of how you're going to spend it in marketing, it's not a lot of money. And that's a really horrible thing. Like, I don't even agree that I've just said those words, but you've got a startup founder who's like really excited that they've raised all this money. And then you have to say to them, okay, I know you want to do these 10 things. I know you want to do like a tube campaign and a TV ad, but you can't do any of that with the budget that you've raised. That's further down the line. And you have to, I'd say when you're working with smaller companies, the skill is about that pragmatism and expectation management and trying to get everyone on the same page about the things you can invest in, and then about finding the best fit suppliers and the fractionals that are going to support that. I certainly agree with what Andreas said. Like, if you're a CMO, you shouldn't be executing, like, well, you certainly shouldn't be, you know, aspiring to execute. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of times I've had to jump in and do those things because, you know, if you're in that startup environment, you have to get your hands dirty in all kinds of ways. You know, I've even had a client have been on hold to PayPal for 2 hours because their gateway broke or something. But that's not what you should, you know, aspire to be doing as a CMO. You should be trying to put in the infrastructure for everybody else to be doing that.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Man, that's painful hearing you say that. 500K is not a lot in marketing. That's difficult. I saw a post recently from a recruiter in marketing. So we don't do much in recruitment and marketing side. We've never placed I don't think I've ever placed anyone in marketing actually. So this is about as close to marketing that I've ever come. And he said something like, stop calling it a marketing director or stop calling it a CMO. You need to hire, and it was about 10 different posts, and some of them you said, like a social media executive, a copywriter, you know, and all the performance coach. And it is difficult. Like, if you're not in marketing, you sort of think, well, our marketing's broken, we'll get a CMO to fix that. And so from the kind of the founder owner positions, it's a difficult thing to be in. How do you navigate that? How do you, if we do have startups listening, either now or afterwards, how do they know what kind of CMO to hire? How do they know what part of their marketing needs to be fixed first, or how to navigate that? Any advice on that?
So much to say about this. Okay, so firstly, not enough startups are hiring CMOs. What I have been seeing a lot of recently is this ridiculous job description, and everybody has seen it. It's a 40 to 60K person who is going to execute social media, execute SEO, execute paid search. They're also going to manage suppliers. They're also going to do analytics reporting. And I keep seeing these job descriptions and I just think this is so unfair, right? It's made up, right? You know, it's like me, I'm renovating my house. Sure, I want a plumber, I want an electrician, I want a decorator. I want all to work for 100 quid a day. Doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And I think there's a lot of, especially when the market goes a bit more to a recruiters market, you see more and more of these nonsense job descriptions. And I think when the market's really tough, people start applying for these types of roles, and you think, who is really going to take that role? If someone is qualified enough to do all the things on that job description and they're one person, they're a lot more money than that, right? Or it's 5 people. And so I'm really sick of seeing that job description, and I've been sent in by investors so many times by startups who have hired a 40K or a 50K to go and spend 2 million investment money, and it just goes wrong. The money it's a bigger waste. For example, I got pulled in by investors last year to a startup. The investors gave the exact same advice to the founder, said, hire a CMO, even if it's part-time, you need that level of expertise in the business. The founder didn't take the advice. The founder hired a freelancer on like 60K, and this guy went on to waste £500,000 on Meta without any tracking. And he told the founder that it was because iOS had broken tracking. And so, you know, that cost them 5 or 6 times more than if they'd actually just hired the right CMO in the first place. And I get pulled in all the time to fix things like this. So yeah, startup founders, find a CMO to be like a safe pair of hands, a bit of an insurance policy. Sure, bring in the junior people, but it's a bit unfair to put that on them when there's not the expertise and guidance in the business.
So just to make sure I understand that correctly, you're saying hire somebody that could come in as the leader, but not the executor for a shorter period of time. to then be like, so that you don't try and hire someone to do everything.
It doesn't exist. And then the other thing I would say as well is if you hire someone who's really, really good, who's a graduate or a recent graduate, and they're really hungry to learn and they've got really good attitude, if they can't learn in that environment, they're going to leave your business. And if you're, you've got juniors reporting straight into a CEO, they're probably not getting much face time. They're probably getting a lot of sort of micromanagement when things go wrong. And they need someone who's there, they can learn from and they can commit to their future in the company. And I think that's probably overlooked a little bit by founders because churn costs money and recruitment is a headache and training is a headache. But if you've got the right sort of fractional leadership team in there, then the junior people can progress through the company and they can learn and they can see that the company's invested in their future development as well.
Brilliant. Okay, well said. Okay, so right, I'm gonna hold there. Now I'm gonna go, Andreas, to the second part of your story, which I'm really interested to hear about. At this point and moving forward, if anyone has any conversation, any questions they want to ask, feel free to use the chat box in the bottom right hand corner as a way. If you don't want to interrupt, put your hand up if you've got something direct. Any way that you want to get involved. Simon, do you have a question now?
Well, I had an observation, if I may, just on what Andreas and Amy were saying, following along and nodding vigorously. But I think that I just want to make a build, if I may. What resonated with me about what Amy said was the leadership aspect and the need to be a fully fledged senior person, I think, in charge of function, and for owners to recognise that the function needs respect and needs proper resource. And with that, I think I would add that they need to seek the input of those candidates and the eventual incumbent on shaping the role and the formation of that function and its resourcing going forward. But I think the other thing that I picked up from Andreas, and I take slight issue with the idea that the CMO is only there to lead the people. Andreas put his finger on something which I see lacking in marketers a lot, and more with marketing becoming more dependent on technology and people that can use technology, is the lack of focus in the marketing effort. And I believe that marketing has always been there and is still responsible for setting the direction and underpinning the external relevance of the company. So it is ultimately there to validate the value proposition of the company. And with that, to Andreas's point and the way that he honed in on three candidates that, in his words, understood marketing. I think what's at the other end of that question of the value of the company and what your message is, who you're speaking to, is what is the opportunity for the company? What's the external opportunity in the marketplace? That's a challenge that is not just ignored a lot these days. People work inside out and work on activities rather than outcomes. But I don't think the skills to do that are very common anymore. To actually segment the market and identify a target that you can win with, where to play and how to win, in other words. But I think that's actually the backbone responsibility of the CMO to ensure that job is being done. Whether they do it themselves, to Amy's point, or not, is another question. But I think upholding that standard and ensuring that the company is focused, understands and focuses on that opportunity in customer terms is critical. So that was my build.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Simon. Just to make sure I captured that correctly, again, I tried to make a bunch of notes around that. But it's this the leadership aspect, the person in charge of the function, but it's this focus that you're talking about here. So setting the direction.
The overarching strategy, yeah. So converting the business strategy into a marketing strategy starts with being sure that there's a customer at the end of the product. And the biggest single cause of startup failures, as I think we may agree, is the biggest tangible and addressable cause of startup failures is lack of product market fit. Marketers are there to avoid that. Senior marketers, and the marketing process starts with that and ends with that.
I really like the way you put it when you said, what is the external opportunity in the marketplace? I think that's a really nice way of encapsulating it. So yeah, cool, great, thank you.
Sorry, can I just very quickly pick up on that, Simon? Because in my experience, product market fit, I think, is the responsibility of marketing, but is a metric that is normally owned by product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a tension there, right?
There is a tension there, I agree. Product is a new phenomenon in companies. I go back to the days of fast-moving consumer goods, which is where I started, where I ran the P&L of businesses in managing large brands like Stella Artois and Cadbury's, and these were days when product was actually called a factory. But the situation is still that there has to be a customer on the end of the value chain, and marketers are best equipped of the people within the firm to identify that external opportunity. Now, product is often the center of complexity in modern technology-led companies, but it doesn't change the fact that there still has to be an external relevance to that. Now, whether they're culturally willing to allow that influence is a challenge, but partnership with the product team is essential to avoid investment in something that is either being I've seen many of my clients, VC-backed tech startups, making something with enormous passion, only to realize two years later that 5 other companies are making exactly the same thing, or that there's simply not a market for their product, and yet culturally product leads the pack.
Well, what I think is really interesting about that is that I've worked in a couple of incubators, and when we're in that phase, we actually allocate money straight onto social media to test, because I've worked on projects where consultants have been brought in, paid lots of thousands to do this piece of work. And I think sometimes that product market fit could be done in a best fit for the size of the venture, and just spending some money on social media helps build up your audience, but it also starts giving you data very, very quickly. So that's something that I've really liked giving input on as the marketing lead, as to how to do that in the earlier gates of the venture.
Brilliant. Okay. At this point, I'm gonna move to what it looks like when it's done well. And this is something I'm really keen to get from both Amy and Andreas on this. So Andreas, as we said, this project, you've been through all this thing, 50 CMOs,
Yep.
very difficult week, I can imagine. And then you got to a point where you've hired your one that's made a difference, and you said that, like when we spoke, you said they totally changed your business and your approach, right? And the results.
They had.
Can you walk us through that, like what they did?
Yeah.
And
Well, it's really nice that we touched on PMF, because I did feel that she did do a bit of product market fit, or PMF. She you know, as Drucker once said in the 80s or the 90s, the goal of marketing is to prevent a business failure. I think he was talking about PMF. And what she did was, you know, apart from she looked, so for the positioning, she looked at the sort of the sort of three main factors that would prevent or push a person in the market, or a company in the market, to work with me. Okay, so did they want flexibility? Was it budget? You know, what were the 3 key critical factors that would kind of position me in the market versus other SEO agents and consultants? And then she would contact all of my clients, interview them. You know, why do you like working with Andreas and Artios? What do you not like? What would you say to anybody thinking of working with Artios? All those questions, and it was really good to get all of their feedback. So it really helped her and I develop a picture of you know, what our positioning should be, and it was good to map our positioning versus the competitors and start. And you know, also she also looked at you know, how we go about delivering SEO in a different way, or a distinctive way compared to our competitors. You know, what makes us different, both in terms of the delivery, the approach, the business model, all of those things. And it really helped, because, you know, when it came to communicating either face to face or in our communications, how we sort of go about telling the world what we're about and how we can help businesses and also who we approach. It just made the whole thing a lot more efficient. It streamlined all of the resources to make sure we don't waste our time talking to people that, whilst they may desire our services, are not really a good fit. All these, and, you know, how we go about, you know, having those conversations, you know, it's the classic marketing, isn't it? Of, you know, right person, right time, right medium. I've probably got that wrong anyway, but you get the gist. It just, because we did all of that homework right at the beginning, you know, if you think about you know, a 2-degree shift doesn't look so much at the beginning, but as you go along over time or a longer distance, that 2-degree shift is actually a very massive gap between, you know, achieving what you want to achieve and where you are. So no, I'm really glad I went through this process, because the effect on, you know, there's been a lot less waste, the kind of waste that Amy has described earlier, you know. So yeah, no, really happy.
Amazing. And do you know what I loved about this story? Why I wanted to speak to Andreas more, and ideally with other people there as well, is just that so much of people that talk about marketing, including myself and various things that I've struggled with, is around failure, is things that don't work, haven't worked, wastage, all that kind of thing. Or marketing consultants or directors that are trying to sell to you, talking about their best efforts, their best projects and things that have worked. And so trying to get sort of almost an external person with no agenda to push to say why something's worked. I'm like, wow, this is gold for me. I'm like, I want to hear more. I want to dig into it. But now I also want to use that as an opportunity like that. It sort of proves that this does work, can work, like, you know, can be a great thing for a business. Unless anyone's got any specific questions on that, feel free to go with that. Amy, I just wanted to ask if you had any examples of as well of where you've come in and you have made that kind of similar impact, you have done something that's worked, and what those projects might have looked like, maybe a couple of different use cases. Again, considering we might have some startups listening who are about to make that awful error of writing a job spec for 40 to 60K to do everything, and don't understand that's not the way to approach this, as I'm sure it would be me. But similar to Andreas, where you have made a difference and you've done it the right way and it did make an impact. Just any parallels with what Andreas was saying there?
Well, it sort of ties into what Andreas was saying right at the beginning. One of my favorite fractional projects was doing naming and identity for a startup that had received funding. And it was one that I was able to do on a fractional basis, because the naming and identity sprint took about 12 weeks. And really, I was leading it. I wasn't the one doing it. So for me, on my fractional hat, I was able to run that process, checking in with the branding agency and interfacing with the leadership and team and the board to make sure they were happy with each sort of stage of the development. And that one, I sort of really pushed sort of for a really punchy outcome with that brand identity, and I really enjoyed it because it went on to win some typography awards and things like that. So again, that's another example of, you know, they could have had me working full time, but at that stage in the company's life cycle, there wasn't enough work to justify having a full-time CMO. And it ties in again to what Andreas said at the beginning, is like, what are you about and what are you saying to your audience? Because one of the things that I find with a lot of the founders that I talk to is that they just can't articulate their company because they're in it every day. It's like trying to describe your own arm. So that's where someone like a fractional CMO can add a lot of value, holding up the mirror. And usually when I'm working on a value proposition with a founder, I feel like a teacher. I'm just taking like a red pen to their documents and their website, because there's two sides of it, right? There's everything the founder wants to say and get off their chest, but there's everything the prospect needs to hear, and those two things are often very, very different. So my favorite thing to do is to work with a really, really good agency on doing that value proposition and identity at the beginning.
Okay, and can you walk through how that would look with like working with a really good agency? So again, let's say, treat me as the founder here, right? I've got everything I want to say and get off my chest, and I can just completely relate with what you're saying, how you describe that. Got a bunch of stuff I want to say and get off my chest. What is going to happen? What's going to be the process from here to you know, when we've got something that works?
Well, the first stage would be finding the supplier that was going to be the best fit. And sometimes you have to do a competitive process, getting sort of 3 to 5 agencies shortlisted and pitching for the work, just so that you can show potentially to investors that you've gone through a responsible procurement process. So that normally adds time at the beginning, because you have to brief the 5 agencies, and then you have to interview them, and then they have to pitch for the, it's never creative ideas, because that would come after they've been engaged, but it would be their process in their previous portfolio. And then you would get into, once you decided which one to work with, it usually starts with 1 or 2 workshops with all the stakeholders involved. And then it just really depends on the individual processes and deliverable timelines from those creative agencies, because it is such a subjective thing to deliver that the creatives have to have quite a tight model. The last thing you want is, right, to get to end of a 4-month sprint or something, and the CEO is getting pitched something that he just did not think he was going to be getting. So the idea is that they check in constantly throughout the process, so that there's no nasty surprises at the end. So that, for me, that's why I was able to run it effectively as a fractional CMO. But if you want to do that pitching at the beginning, like, it does add a lot of time. If you know, people who have done that before often come with a list of agencies that they know can deliver. So I always have a suggestion, but sometimes that's not always the most diplomatic way to start that type of project. And
so you've got the agency in, right? The agency are doing the work, they're collaborating. Asking this question for anyone that doesn't instantly get this, what are you bringing in that process? As a fractional CMO, you've got the agency that's doing the implementation side of this, the CEO that's, you know, wants to, you know, it's got me, you've got the agency. Which part are you bringing to this? What cohesion do you add to that, and how does that play out?
I'd say probably the number one thing is that you're reducing the noise and all the, because if you imagine you've got sort of the team at the agency and you've got the leadership team, you know, I would be having maybe 1 or 2 catch-ups with the leadership team of the client in a week, and then I'd be having 1 catch-up with the branding agency, so that all the communications would sort of funnel through me. And I think the other thing you find as well is that some leadership teams can be quite daunted by jargon that relates to sort of branding or digital media or anything like that. So what I do is I always translate into sort of terms that everybody can understand, because again, like, I've seen all these horrible trends in the industry to use jargon to scare people, and as a really bad sales tactic. I hate it. So I always want to make sure that you're kind of respectfully talking to the lowest level of understanding in a room, so that when decisions are made, there's not, you know, anything that backfires later on because you were using jargon or someone felt intimidated into making a decision. So I think that's a really important layer that I add that probably not enough people talk about doing.
Brilliant. Okay, that's useful, and add some tangibles there. So okay, I'm going to just come back. Sorry, Richard, I saw your question a while ago. Just wanted to dig into that. So Richard, you were asking about a minimum number of days. Is there a minimum number of days a month you think you need to be a fractional CMO, assuming you've got a small team to manage? Richard, do you want to just add just a bit of context onto that, in terms of, just because I can imagine, again, thinking about the back of the napkin versus the 1.7 billion.
Yeah, this excuse me, this really comes from I'm working with a couple of clients at the moment, or working on proposals for a couple of clients, where there's clearly a job of work to do initially, which is about setting the strategy right and the plan, getting the OKRs set up, getting the meetings going, and all of that sort of stuff. Excuse me. But then, and those I'm looking at a couple of days a week for. But in the long term, these are not clients that I think need me for a couple of days a week. But can you do the job on a couple of days a month? Does that work, or are you too far removed by that point?
I honestly don't think that's days. For me, is not really the question. I think the way you have to sort of think about it is that, you know, in an ideal world, everyone probably thinks they want a full-time CMO, but it comes down to cost for a lot of these companies of this size. And I think you need to frame it as like, yes, you're getting a CMO at the fraction of the cost, but there's always going to be, you know, a rub with that. And so it comes with the psychology of how you work. So I would say I've had lots of effective relationships where I'm probably doing just 2 or 3 days a month. But for me, it's about the frequency of when I check in with the founders. And I think they would probably all say that our weekly catch up is kind of the most useful part, because they just want to bounce ideas off someone who can give them good feedback and advice. So I think, you know, even on a day or a half day retainer, you can still manage that cadence of sprint with a founder. I think what comes into it is ways of working. So I've tried to do that level of retainer with a big corporate, and the problem was the culture at the company. So when I signed up with the company, I set the expectation. I said, look, we have this weekly meeting set. This is holy, like we keep this meeting every week because I have a portfolio, you know, you're busy. And what started happening almost immediately is every week the CEO would cancel half an hour before, and then it would take his PA like 2 weeks to reschedule, and then the same thing would happen. And then the flip side of that is then he would just call me at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and talk at me for like an hour, and I would just be like, I can't always accommodate that, because it's just not. So for me, it wasn't about effectiveness or anything. It was just some people feel the need to have a team that they can just always call on, message, and expect an immediate response, and that's culture, and it's totally divorced from effectiveness and deliverables. So I think you just have to recognize those patterns, because if you have a client like that with the expectation set like that, if you can't reset the expectation, then it's just not going anywhere. I would say to cap maximum resource for if you've got a portfolio. I tend to find that if I don't really want to be working with clients more than 4 days a month, because then you end up with one client who has a lot of resource, and it's sort of, again, it comes back to expectation. They sort of expect to be very, very frequently serviced, and then you don't end up giving like a fair distribution of your resource to your portfolio. So my trick is to always try and be regularly resourced at 50%, and then it gives me the flex if a client has a specific need, like a new launch or something like that. So I'll always say to my clients, you can book extra, but I try to set the expectation that it's not, that's not what you would do as business as usual.
That answer your question there, Richard?
Yeah, it does. And I actually really like the idea of being, well, part of me likes the idea of being booked 50%. Part of me thinks I need to be booked more than that, but I just need to charge more.
With higher rates. Yeah, that's the trick, right?
I think clients, it's a give and take, right? So just for example, one of my fractional clients this morning, he needed to cancel the call at short notice, and I was able to reschedule it for tomorrow. But I think if I was booked more than 50-60% capacity, when you start saying no to clients, and there's like that line between like they need servicing and they need that courtesy, I think that's when it starts to get difficult, and that's when relationships start to break down. So it's just, yeah. But I think the thing I would say is that all my clients understand it's give and take. So there's been times when my clients have said, I need you now, and I've had to let another client down, but then they expect that the next time round it will be the other way. So it's 100% about the people and their respect for you and their behaviors, really.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Andreas, when you had your fractional, what kind of rate of work were you working?
So I wasn't expecting anybody full time. Being a fractional SEO, I probably have a lot more empathy, perhaps, than a regular founder, if is such a thing as a regular founder. So, you know, we just agreed on a project, its outcomes, its scope. Although I was charged on a time basis, you know, what was quite good, as Amy intimated, was the regular check-in, you know, asking for information. But yes, you know, we would arrange calls in advance, and yes, I get it that real life happens and calls get cancelled, but I think there is a certain matter, if you don't want to use the word respect, then I would say priority, to make sure you stick to these calls as a founder, as I have, because I recognize the importance and the impact. Even though I don't have a crystal ball, it turns out that my faith was absolutely justified, that these calls were worth prioritizing, and the work we were doing was transformational, as it proved to be. So that's basically how we ended up running the show, so to speak.
Brilliant. Okay, interesting to get the the various ways things work. So Yeah, perfect. Okay, Kayla. Now, I know you submitted a question on sign up about this, and you mentioned it just in the introduction. Do you know what? It might be easier if you kind of explain and give some context and go through it.
Yeah, I mean, of course. Thank you, Barry. I think one of the things that I found is, as a CMO, you're really at the core of understanding where the business strategy. So helping, either set the business strategy and then the marketing strategy beneath that, but also monitoring that performance. Like, where are we? Have we met our revenue goals for this quarter and all of those great things? There's also the culture of the team and motivation and making sure that you're meeting your sales goals. So I guess my question for, and I've had a bit of experience in this, but I'm kind of questioning from a fractional perspective, how do you stay on top of all of that? When you're maybe not doing more than a day a month, how do you stay on top of each of those objectives and marketing's function and role within them?
Well, so I would say if you're doing a day a month, you probably shouldn't be taking the buck for that side of things. I think what it comes down to is accountability about how you use that time. So, for example, I've had clients where every week I've been giving them advice and I've kept a running tracker of what bits of advice they've implemented. And sometimes you can get to the end of 6 months and, you still haven't got anything from them, And so I think when it comes back to accountability, if things aren't working out, you can just sort of say, look, these are the 25 things that we've been discussing about implementing, and only 2 of them have gone live. And this is how that impacts the revenue. I think, again, if you've got, it's really hard to answer without knowing like the specifics. But I would say if you've got something like targets running through digital media, you should have someone who's there kind of most days to check that, especially if it's a significant level of spend, for example, and that's tracking back to ROAS and sales. So, you can do all sorts of clever things with alerts in those systems that you can see what the revenues were. I mean, I've worked in companies where all they care about each morning is seeing how much money was made the day before, regardless of what was spent to achieve, for so many big organizations, the incoming money is kind of keeping the plane in the air, right? So that's the number one focus, and you end up looking at why it might have dipped. But in terms of how marketing metrics tie into that, for me, that's even in really much bigger organizations, it's tended to be like a monthly or a weekly check-in. But I would certainly, if I was only working 1 day a month for a client, I would certainly kind of be a bit resistant to taking a responsibility for a P&L, because it's just not enough time to really take responsibility for that. And that's something that you'd have to at the outset set the expectation. It's like, okay, you've got a digital marketing manager, they need to contact me if X, Y, or Z happens, rather than you having that every day, because then that's disproportionate to what you've been brought in to do.
I think proportion is a really key word there, because I think founders should keep their expectations in check. I always view marketing and SEO as, you want to get from A to B. So obviously, if you're traveling from London to Manchester, then you're not going to require as much budget as you would going from London to Edinburgh, for example. And if you want to get there faster, then clearly you're going to need more budget for fuel. And I see no difference for marketing and SEO. If you want to get somewhere sooner, or you want to go further, then you're clearly going to need more budget. Our skills could maybe help defy the laws of physics, but only to a certain extent.
Yeah, thank you. And just a follow-up question, Barry, if I may, to either Andreas or to Amy. Does that suggest that, therefore, your answers suggest that the type of work that you might take on from a monthly perspective versus being a kind of seeing somebody weekly is much more kind of high level? It's maybe directing the team to make sure that you're keeping to those OKRs and performance metrics that have been set. For the weekly type of projects where you are a bit more hands-on, maybe you're a bit more, is that because you're focusing on specific projects like a brand refresh or a new website? Can you just give me a breakdown of what that kind of looks like?
Yeah, so for me, where I've been engaged sort of 1 to 2 days a month, the team, and again, a lot of companies have a very different psychology about employees and then consultants. And I've been a consultant for donkey's years, so it's very unusual that I would be given direct reports. You know, there's been times when founders have asked me about disciplinary matters and sort of getting people firing people, but that's more because I've been a business founder myself and a senior leadership in the senior leadership myself. So I've had kind of inexperienced founders ask me how to make someone redundant, things like that. But in terms of their performance, it's not something that's come to me. The CEO tends to still manage because of the size of the company, the CEOs then tend to still manage the marketing team. It would be like 1 or 2 people in a company of 10 to 15 people. So that's how they would do it. Where I've been involved with bigger companies, honestly, the reason they have more days is because they like to have more meetings. So you end up having lots and lots of meetings about meetings. And quite a lot of the time, they've got used to sort of the cadence of me being in lots of meetings. And if they did want me to do, say, like a 2023 strategy document, I'd say to them, right, that's an extra 2 days, unless I don't come to meetings for the next month. Because I think one thing I do find founders don't really realize is if they're not using your time effectively, because you can sort of say that I can come to all these meetings, but I've so far spent 75% of my billable hours have been in meetings. Is that how you want to proceed? You know, you have to kind of lay it out like that, because there's this idea that you're still in all these meetings and then they're getting the 2 days on top, and you have to really, if you're really only doing 2 days or 4 days, you really have to knock that on the head.
Amy, is there that implicit assumption that if you're expected to attend all these meetings, that they expect you to prepare for these meetings in your own time, implicitly even?
To be honest, I haven't, where I've been asked to go to lots of meetings, they're not normally my meetings. I'm much more about doing sprints. During lockdown, I was working in 2 tech startups where we would do a 15-minute sprint every morning. And I actually tried to introduce that to one of the corporate teams I was running, because I think what that does is it fleshes out people who are sitting on their hands. So, you know, if you're having a sprint every morning, you can't say the same thing for 5 days in a row. And it also, where there's what we call blockers. So if you needed something from another part of the company and it still wasn't being delivered, it really shone a light on that. So for me, I much prefer that way of working to sort of any big death by PowerPoint thing that you might have. For me, those would be explicit asks from the leadership team. And I much prefer to get a really well-oiled way of working.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We're just closing in on time there. Do you know what I'm finding really interesting for this, and a bit of a personal observation from what you've been saying and what I'm seeing across various other sessions that we run, various different disciplines, is this importance of setting yourself up for success is something that I think the more experience you get as a fractional, the more you understand just how important it is to understand the right expectations going into it, make sure that they're real crystal clear and aligned and agreed up front, figuring out your boundaries and you know, setting those in stone up front. This is what I'm prepared to do, and this is past the boundary, and sticking to that. It's really interesting. And Amy, hearing how kind of aggressive you are, ruthless around these are my boundaries. This is what I do. This is what I don't do. But I think, you know, as it feels like that's where you've got to, and that's such an important thing. Not to that if you don't do, you end up in deep water, and you end up in a lot of problems. And I think by doing that up front, you know, very, very well, I think is I think it's just something I've noticed from you know, these themes that are running across various different things I'm doing.
I don't think it's a fractional. Like, every freelancer will tell you without fail that they've had some nightmare with out of scope requests and it hasn't been managed properly. And even today I saw a LinkedIn poll about should you have an out of scope request clause in your contract, and it had like 97% yes answer from the freelancer community. So yeah, I think it's a really tough one. And again, it's about the long game and the relationships, and occasionally you're going to do the odd thing that's a bit outside of the norm. But if you start getting into doing it regularly, kind of making a rod for your own back, and you just have to be careful and transparent and fair on everyone.
Brilliant. Again, well said. Thank you so much, Amy, Andreas. Thank you so much for sharing everything. And Richard, Kayla, and Susie, thank you for sticking out as well. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I'd highly recommend everyone connects on LinkedIn. You never know where these networks and opportunities and stuff are going to come from. So we'll follow up anyway for some feedback. Yeah, thanks for being here, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.
Thanks for organising. Thanks, Barry.
Bye.